May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. You may be seated. Well, Holy Nativity, welcome to Advent. It's that time of year where we, the church, get to celebrate Christ's coming into the world to be Emmanuel, or God with us. When I hear the word Advent, I often find myself thinking about Christmas, candles, mangers, nativity scenes of all sorts, and the like. And I am sure that may be where your mind goes first, too. We like to think of the Christmas story during Advent. We like to decorate for this time, too, because it does bring out a lot of joy to think of God sending his Son for us and the fond memories we have with this season. So that if that is where our minds go when we hear the word Advent, what is the deal with our readings today? Isn't it a bit odd that we are talking about cataclysms, signs in the sun, fear, the day of the Lord? The day of the Lord is, after all, the ending of the story, and might not seem like a great place to begin this season of awaiting the beginning of our experience with God with us in the flesh. Is the lectionary just off this weekend? Actually, the end is the perfect place to begin when thinking about the word Advent. The word Advent itself, being an anglicized version of the Latin adventus, simply means to arrive or to come. In the Latin Bible, this word is actually used several times as a translation of the original Greek word parousia, meaning the same things as above, to arrive or to come. What makes it more interesting is that the word parousia is used in theological vocabularies as a way of describing the second coming of Christ. So Advent, a time wherein we celebrate the coming of the Lord, certainly has room for reflection on his second coming. More than that, it's appropriate to use the time of Advent as a time of thinking about all of the ways in which Christ comes to us in between Bethlehem and the day of the Lord. He comes to us each and every day, doesn't he? From your baptism to each and every Eucharist, from your prayers to your engaging with the Scriptures, from your spending time with your family and the church to your engagement of strangers in the world, Christians acknowledge that Christ is constantly coming to us and constantly being God with us. So Advent has a threefold shape here: the birth of Jesus, the continuing presence of Jesus, and the second coming of Jesus. Thus, the end is where we begin today, as a way of reminding us how great the Adventus of Christ really is. Advent is not something we remember as a historical event 2,000 years ago alone, but it is a perpetual reminder that Christ is with us and that he is coming for us. With this in mind today, I want to look at what this text in the Gospel of Luke is trying to communicate to us. What is Jesus saying about his second coming? Should we be sitting with the news on, a newspaper in one hand and a Bible in the other, trying to interpret the signs of the times, trying to crack the mystery of Christ's second coming? Well, let's see what Jesus has to say, and then we can draw our own conclusions. Earlier in the Gospel of Luke, especially in chapter 21, before we get to our readings for this morning, it is important to note that Jesus has been talking about an actual historical event that has taken place in history. He has been discussing with his disciples the coming destruction of the temple and the crushing of the city of Jerusalem. Jesus is talking about events that will take place only 40 years after he spoke of them. In 70 AD, there was a Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire. an empire that had already conquered the land of Palestine some 130 years prior. During this rebellion, the Roman forces reached the walls of Jerusalem. They burned the temple to the ground, and they destroyed much of the city surrounding it. And this was meant as a signal to the Jewish people that there are consequences for your rebellion, and those consequences are serious. Now, to a Jewish person, the destruction of the temple would be the worst fate for their people imaginable. Their direct access to God through sacrifice and worship was now utterly destroyed. It would be as if the world itself, again, were coming to its end. But when Jesus speaks of these events, he makes claims that no, the destruction of the temple is not the end, but it is something that comes before the end. Clearly, as we are ever nearing 2,000 years removed from those events, it was not the end of the world. What Jesus is doing, so it seems, is establishing that his followers are not to be in the business of fearing the end when the great imperial army comes marching its way towards the walls of Jerusalem. Rather, they are looking for something else to come. He is making a clear distinction between the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in 70 AD and his second coming. Now let's think about our reading this morning more directly. What exactly does Jesus mean when he talks about signs in the heavens, fig trees, and his coming? Well, for us, this passage might come off as a bit of a mystery. But if you were to be reading this with a keen awareness of the Old Testament, much of what Jesus is saying would actually not come as much of a shock or surprise to the system at all. The Old Testament prophets spoke often of signs in the heavens, the powers of the heavens being shaken, and the coming day of the Lord. And much like the prophets in the Old Testament, it seems we are not being given the when these signs are taking place, or even really being told outright what these signs are. But we are being given these signs as a way of communicating that God is going to act within human history. When the Old Testament prophets would discuss the day of the Lord or other events, the language seldom, if ever, comes outright and tells the audience, here is exactly what will take place and when it will take place. Rather, signs, symbols, figurative language, and illustrations are often employed in order to capture the air of the situation for their audience. So when Jesus mentions signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, he does not tell us what exactly these signs will be or when they will be. Rather, he is telling us that the events of the day of the Lord are darkness. The earth's source of light, the sun, and the moon at night are going to be made null. But in the midst of that darkness, then is when he will come back for his people. The same can be said of his using of the fig tree as an example of his second coming. He makes a rather controversial statement in saying, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. Everyone from that generation has been long dead. So we certainly have quite a challenge on our hands. Either Jesus was wrong, a most heinous statement to be sure, or we need to be very careful when reading this text. What is most likely happening here is that Jesus is going back and forth between discussing the immediate destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and his second coming. He does not seem to be indicating that the second coming will take place in 70 AD, when that generation is still alive, but that the destruction of the temple will serve as a sign that he could return at any moment. And if this is true, and I think it is, his return has been imminent since 70 AD. We are in the last days, but we have been in them for nearing 2,000 years now. We are perpetually walking in the in-between times, in the last days. So let me wrap this up with a thought. What is the point of all of this? Why is Jesus giving us signs, but being vague about his signs? Why is he telling us to keep watch and to know that the summer is coming, but not giving us more to hold on to in the meantime? To be frank, why is he not telling us when his coming will be? For this, I turn to one of the saints of old, Saint Ambrose of Milan, one of our bishops living in the 4th century, who wrote of this passage, and he said this: "For it was not to our advantage to know the time of the end, in order that we, being ignorant of the actual moments of judgment to come, might ever be, as it were, on guard, and set on the watchtower of virtue, and so avoid the habits of sin, lest the day of the Lord should come upon us in the midst of our wickedness. For it is not to our advantage to know, but rather to fear the future. Therefore, I have said that it was not to our advantage to know. Nay, it is to our advantage to be ignorant, that through ignorance we might fear. Through watchfulness be corrected. As he himself said, be ye ready, for ye know not the hour the Son of Man cometh. For the soldier does not know how to watch in the camp unless he knows that the war is at hand." St. Ambrose is convinced that not knowing the end, only having vague signs and warnings of the end, is good for us because it creates in us a disposition of one who is in a constant state of faithfulness. We know that Christ will return, but if we know when, we would be tempted to delay being faithful until the day of his coming. Why waste your time being good when you can just do it and he can come and see you doing it? Not knowing, on the other hand, makes every day a day to follow Christ, a day to wait, and a day to live as though it were the very day of the Lord. So with this in mind, let us take full advantage of this season of Advent. Let us watch and live as though Christ himself were to return at this very moment. These texts are not written to give us a roadmap to the end of time. That isn't what apocalyptic images are for at all. Rather, they are given to us to encourage our faithfulness to Christ and to bolster our hope in the salvation that he is to bring with him. Endure to the end as we begin pondering the beginnings, my friends. Amen.
Amen.